those links.
Elizabeth Phil, are we good to admit?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Yes.
And good afternoon, folks. We will start in just 30 seconds as we admit people. We welcome you to turn your camera on so you could join us and we can have as much of a conversation feel as we can during these somewhat more distanced times. And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It is about 1:30 here on the East Coast as we welcome hundreds of you from across the country and a little bit beyond to the third of our series that we are doing with the authors of Sexual Citizens. My name is Joseph Storch. I use he and him. I'm an associate counsel at the State University of New York, and I am privileged to be here with you alongside my great colleague and partner in crime prevention, prevention, Elizabeth Brady, who is the interim executive director of the Arrive Center and who's having me do the introduction for this. We have switched off. What a privilege it has been to work with Jennifer and Shamus on this, and we are going to get right into our content in just a few minutes. We have closed captioning from a professional captioner, and that is available in the tray at the bottom of your Zoom by turning on live transcript. We welcome you to turn your cameras on. We want this to feel like a living room as much as it can in these awful COVID times of social distancing and the like. So please do turn your camera on, and our speakers, I think, benefit from head nods yes or head nods no or whatever else you want to throw at them. We want to acknowledge that some of the content that we are going to talk about may be triggering to some folks, and we want to point you to the hotline from RAIN. One of my colleagues will put that in the chat, as well as if you are here in the state of New York, you can use the SAVER website, the Sexual Assault and Violence Response website that we run here at SUNY, and that is response.suny.edu. The first two recordings of our sessions, the opening conversation on Sexual Citizens, as well as the one on space and construction are available, and we will happily share the links with you to watch those and benefit from them. But today we turn to another deeply important topic, which is the overlap of sexual assault, sexual harassment, and sexual violence and equity. we know from our climate survey here at the State University of New York, and we run the second largest in the nation, as well as the climate surveys run by our institutions across the country, that sexual and interpersonal violence does not strike everyone equally. In fact, it is deeply inequitable in who are the victims and who are impacted, and it is inequitable in terms of what resources they have on the campus and in the community when they are affected. For some people, they are the third generation to go to college. They are much wiser as to it. They have access. They might know family members who work at the institution and the like, and others have really just gotten there and don't have that deep background. And for a variety of things having to do more with everything else on our planet and in our nation, there is deep inequity that is certainly felt on our college campuses. We are so blessed to have some of our great friends and the scholars, Dr. Jennifer Hirsch, who's a professor of socio-medical sciences. I always have to check to make sure I have it exactly right, at Columbia University, and our friend and colleague, Dr. Shamus Khan, who's a professor of sociology and American studies at Princeton University. They are the authors of the book Sexual Citizens. We have had so many great conversations with them. It is one of the few really groundbreaking works that have come out during my career. Elizabeth Brady, my colleague, when she read it, she said, like, oh, this is actually something, right? There were so many rewriting of things. She said, this is actually something. We gotta work with these folks. And they will be joined today by Monica Nixon, who is the Assistant Vice President for Equity, Inclusion, and Social Justice at NASPA. And we are so glad to have her. Before we begin, we do want to acknowledge that our dear colleague at SUNY, Terry Miller, was going to be the host and conversationalist here. She was our Senior Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Equity, as well as a professor of law at the University at Buffalo, who unfortunately passed away a little bit earlier in the summer. She was someone who was deeply committed to this work and deeply committed to finding the overlap between equity and harassment prevention in a way that would allow our students and community members and faculty and staff to really reach their potential. And so many of the initiatives she had, and we were very sorry to lose her. But we are glad and thankful that Monica stepped in to help us. NASPA is a deeply important organization to the State University of New York, and we are so happy to have all of you. This is going to be a deeply interesting conversation, and I'm so pleased to be able to shut up at this point and turn it over to Monica and to Jennifer and to Shamus to get us started. Monica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe. Welcome to all of you who are joining us today. As Joe noted, there is so much to learn from the research and this book. Andrew noted that in the chat. Today, we've chosen to focus on how the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion intersects with sexual assault prevention. I've had the honor of speaking with the authors before when we hosted 2 webinars that explored the connections between sexual assault and race. Today, we're expanding that conversation to understand the ways that sexual assault and DEI programming must be integrated. So DEI work, I've worked on college. I worked for NASPA for 3 years, DEI work on campuses for about 20 years before that. And that work has evolved. Certainly it evolved before I came into it. It's evolved over the past 25 years. But it's really deepened and expanded, right? We understand that trainings and interventions at the individual level that focus on bad actors or good intentions are necessary, but incredibly insufficient to address the work of justice. We need to address power inequalities that are built into the fabric of campus life. Similarly, the book Sexual Citizens brings the systemic lens to explaining campus sexual assault as produced by also these inequalities that are built into the fabric of campus life, and even into what students are bringing in with them to our campus communities. So the authors brought a complex intersectional analysis, which we'll discuss further today. This is going to be a very lively conversation. I'll invite Jennifer and Shamus if there are any introductory remarks you want to offer before we jump in.
Just thank you for that very generous introduction. We're delighted to be with you today.
Okay, well, let's begin with why you wrote this book.
The question. So we're going to draw all the listeners in actually with a story because, as you know, Monica, the book is very story driven. And it's a story about two white students, just to situate them. So Lucy was super excited to arrive on campus for academic reasons, but also social ones. She had a plan for the first couple months of college. She wanted to meet some boys, make out, and eventually lose her virginity. She'd gone to boarding school and had been pretty sheltered. So she was excited when a girl in her hall, Nancy, asked if she wanted to go out to a bar in Morningside Heights. Neither of them were 21, but pretty white girls, no trouble getting into bars in Morningside Heights. So while they were there, they met two older guys, seniors. Lucy and Scott talked, they danced, they drank a little, they made out. He invited her back to the fraternity, and that felt super exciting, sort of like the whole plan falling into place. As they walked up Amsterdam Avenue, her phone was ringing, and it turned out it was Nancy, her friend, who had gotten that bystander intervention and wanted to check up and make sure that Lucy was okay. So they waited. The three of them went into the fraternity. Scott asked the girls if they wanted some drinks. Fraternities are not allowed to serve hard alcohol, but they're also, I guess we could describe it as lightly policed. And so they keep the alcohol upstairs on the second floor. So Scott and the two girls went upstairs. Nancy passed out almost right away. And Scott asked Lucy if she wanted to go up to his bedroom on the third floor. And she did. So all fine. Until he starts to unbutton her pants. And she was a virgin. She had never thought that this was going to end in sex. And she was very clear. She said, "No, don't." To which he said, "It's okay." And then you can fill in the rest of the story. And so your first take in hearing that story might be Scott, a terrible person. That's not entirely a bad take. Certainly what he did was a terrible thing. But a conversation around campus sexual assault that only focuses on bad people misses the fact that anything that happens so frequently can't just be a product of individual decision-making. There has to be a social element to it. And so we did the research that we present in Sexual Citizens to change the national conversation around campus sexual assault, which has been so focused on sort of the idea of campuses as a hunting ground and sociopathic perpetrators, or on improving adjudication, which is important, but we want to look upstream and say, how about we just do better so that there are fewer assaults? And doing better entails the ambitious vision of sexual assault prevention that we share in the book. So this idea of sexual assault being socially produced, it's not just that Scott was a man and Lucy was a woman. There are all kinds of ways in which that interaction, there are power inequalities built into it. Scott controlled the space. He was accustomed to being on a campus where Lucy was a newcomer and where the prime directive during orientation week for first-year students is just not to do anything too embarrassing. He had the advantage of whiteness that we'll talk about more in a minute. He was advantaged by his wealth. So many, it wasn't, we can't think about that interaction just in terms of gender. So we'll, over the course of the next 45 minutes, unpack that. But basically, the why we wrote the book is to change the conversation from reporting and adjudication to prevention.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you for starting us with a story that's grounded in the students' experiences, right? I think for those of us who have read this book, the power of it really is in the ways that you all have connected these narratives and the deep research and observational data that you all did with these broader conversations that we need to have. So thank you. So we started with the story of Lucy and Scott. So that's a story about a powerful white man. So how do we get from there to your analysis about the intersections of sexual assault and diversity, equity, and inclusion work?
Yeah, part of that story that Jennifer told is about the intertwinings of whiteness and power, and thinking about critically how an analysis of whiteness is necessary to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in particular, an analysis of whiteness and power. But that's only going to get us so far. We spoke to a woman named Charisma. All the names in the book are pseudonyms, and she, when we talked to her, described Columbia as a white space. And what she meant by that, in her own words, was that it was filled with white guys who drank too much, couldn't dance, and listened to shitty music. And as she began to tell her story, she sort of explained to us how she ended up out in Brooklyn one evening. And she'd spoken to her roommate about the difficulty of finding men who found her attractive, and clearly from her own description, who she found attractive. And through that conversation, she met this guy and they texted back and forth. And finally, she gets out to his apartment in Brooklyn, kind of magically. Everything went wrong and she somehow managed to find him. They got to his place. They had a drink. They smoked part of a joint. They started to make out. And then he assaulted her within that space. And again, when I tell that story, it's an abbreviated version of the one that's in the book. The take home might be, what a terrible guy. But Jennifer and I kind of want to open up that story a little bit and think about how, when talking about Columbia as a white space, like, I didn't do that just for an effect of a way to open the story, but she was literally bringing in a kind of spatial analysis of campus life. So running through the book are these three main ideas of sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies. And I want to focus on the sexual geographies point right now. And the idea of sexual geographies is that space isn't just part of the backdrop of our lives. It actually produces all kinds of interactions and outcomes. So, if you think about where you're sitting right now, or what your clothing choices could have been over the last 18 months if you weren't going into the office, like, space created conditions of possibility for you and conditions of impossibility. I, for example, am not wearing shoes right now because I'm at home, but there's really no way that if I were in my office, I would be shoeless, right? And so there's something about space that produces forms of action that we can undertake. But it's not as simple as just wearing shoes or not. It goes much deeper than that. And campus geographies are enmeshed with power inequalities. So when Charisma described Columbia as a white space, what she was partially conveying was that the high value social spaces on campus were controlled by heterosexual white men. Columbia and Barnard have a Greek life system. And within that Greek life system, men are allowed to serve alcohol at their events and women are not. That's part of how Greek life functions. That gives men control over the distribution of alcohol on campus. So, that is something really important to the spatial dynamics. The other parts of the story is that Charisma ended up in Brooklyn in part because of those spatial dynamics, in part because in experiencing campus as a white space, she was driven off campus. Our point here isn't that, like, Brooklyn is a dangerous place to be. I was born in Brooklyn, right? Like, that's not really what I'm trying to convey. But where other students have, in many ways, the benefits of being surrounded by peers who had bystander intervention training, who may be looking out for them, Charisma did not enjoy that. There's also a broader intersectional analysis here. Charisma was not from a wealthy family, and some of her classmates may have been able to open up an app on their phone, call a car to pick them up and take them home. Charisma was looking at a 2-hour commute back, and she was in a space controlled by this man. The racialization of the distribution of space matters for that story. I want to tell a second story, and I'm going to do so a little bit more briefly because I've been going on, and it's the story of Carl. Carl was an African-American man who talked to us about his concerns about sexual contact with white women. And his concerns were particularly pronounced around in contexts where white women had been drinking. And he told us this story about how, he met this woman at a party. She was really into him. He was into her, but he didn't feel comfortable hooking up with her just yet because he assessed that she was not sober enough. So he walked her around for 2 hours. They walked around campus for 2 hours just chatting, went back to his room. He waited a full another hour before he consented to sexual contact. He told us, though, people can consent in the moment and then later they can say anything and I'm going to be in trouble. This was a common refrain from men in general, especially cis hetero men, but it was one that was even more pronounced in Carl's case. In fact, Carl told us that after he'd had sexual contact with this woman, he recorded her before she left saying that she'd had a really good time. And he layered onto this that he had done his research. He looked up to know that New York was a one-party consent state, meaning he could make that recording and it would be admissible in court in his defense if the woman changed her mind the next day. Now, part of this story is thinking about the weight of race and Black men's encounters with the so-called criminal justice system and how that influences their actions and behaviors. What we see here is how race is embedded into the very fabric of sexual encounters, and campuses, in our view, aren't just magical institutions that can erase the inequities that come from the outside world. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't try to do this, but what it does mean is that people carry that history with them and they carry that reality into those spaces.
Thanks, Shamus. Christmas story really drives home so powerfully how race and class produce situations of vulnerability. In what ways or how did you find similar dynamics for students with other minoritized identities?
So we found similar and yet different dynamics for Latinx students, for example, which, as Shamus was indicating through Carl's story or charismas, play out in intersection with things like relative wealth. Lupe, for example, who used they, them pronouns, was a first generation queer student who tried to get off campus to find a place that she would feel at home in the spring of her first year at school. She was tired, she described, of the drama of the campus's relatively small LGBTQ community. And so she went to a bar, and she was also desperate in a way that is resonant of Charisma's story to get away from what she also described as shitty white music at parties. And so she found a bar that played bachata, and she was happy just to like be in a place that felt a little more familiar. I'm sorry, they. Then they were sort of taken aback when a man offered to buy them a drink. And they were like, sure, a drink is probably half of my spending money for the week, so I'll take the drink. And he must have slipped something in the drink, because then they recounted a truly horrific story, which I'm not going to share here. But my point is that Lupe would not have found herself necessarily in that bar if there were parties on campus that had music that was her music. And in the book, actually, we tell a story of a party that did play music where Latinx students felt at home. It was a suite in the part of campus where juniors and seniors live, which are good party spaces, typically controlled by a fraternity, but the fraternity lent it to a group of Latinx students to have a party for September 15th, which is when Mexican Independence Day is typically celebrated. And so it was not a heavy drinking party. There was a little bit of drinking. There was a lot more dancing than you would find. And it's a very tender scene in the book of students finding a place where they feel at home. One of the students says, "These are all my little babies here." So she was really creating a moment in space and time where students could have a break from the daily whiteness of campus. So I think those two stories, Lupe's story and then that party, sort of show us both how the whiteness of campus is part of the production of vulnerability, and also how possible it is to create other kinds of spaces.
Thanks. You both noted just the conversations. You talked about geographies, projects, and citizenship as three of the threads through the book. So you've talked about sexual geographies, you've talked about sexual projects, and also about sexual citizenship. So thanks for, again, using the students' narratives to really elevate those three areas. So we've talked a lot about race, and diversity, equity, inclusion work, of course, is about more. We talked about Lupe's queer identity, identifying there. So can you speak more broadly to the experiences of other minoritized student experiences? So for example, that of queer students or others that may have come through in the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Jennifer opened with this sort of outline of the purpose of the book, which was to talk about prevention. And a second arm of that sort of point about prevention is the realization that sexual assault is not one thing, it's many different things. So, I think you all who are in on this call know this, that there's differences between unwanted touching and rape in terms of what leads to those things. People's effective experiences of them can be very varied as well, but there's also a difference between, say, being raped at a party or at the end or as a consequence of being at some party where there's a lot of alcohol, and then it happening in the context of an intimate partner relationship where maybe no alcohol is involved at all. And one of the arguments that we make is that so much of our attention to sexual assault really centers the experience of whiteness. And what we mean by that is that white students drink more on average than other students. They drink significantly more than Asian students. They drink significantly more than African-American students. And the kinds of assaults that we pay a lot of attention to, those sort of Scott and Lucy's story that we opened with of drunken assaults happen in fraternities, are a particular class of assaults that are more likely to be experienced by white students. And what we try to do in Sexual Citizens is sort of open up the conversation a little bit to say, well, actually, there are lots of other different kinds of experiences that are different. And we're not just trying to be academics here by saying like, it's complicated, right? Actually, central to our analysis is expanding really the classic account of why assault happens, which is power inequities, and recognizing that gender and power is incredibly important, but also recognizing that gender isn't the only form of power and that gender intersects with other kinds of relationships. And so as we tell these stories around diversity, equity, and inclusion, what one of our core points is to think about equity really centrally as being the kind of lever that seeks to balance out those power inequities that are producing assaults. So, for example, Adam was a young man who grew up in the Midwest, from a very conservative household that really denied the possibility and the legitimacy of Adam's gay identity. And Adam wasn't out to his family. He was so excited to get to New York City where he might be able to meet gay men. And then he met gay men and he was a little less excited because he sort of found that they constantly wanted to meet him and hook up with him and then ghost him. And so Adam was really happy when he finally found a boyfriend, and he spoke really kind of lovingly about the relationship and how important it was to him, except as he told us that his boyfriend was sometimes really forceful about sex. And then Adam proceeded to tell us a story of his boyfriend coming home drunk one night, and in Adam's words, he basically raped me. That story was actually representative of a very common experience in the LGBTQIA community. Some of the highest rates of assault are within that community. And Adam's experience of assault, from our perspective, is inexorably tied to a family experience that denied the legitimacy of his sexual project, of his sexual desires, and of his sexual citizenship. That then is a question of equity. It's also a question of how Adam's concern about losing his relationship was centrally located in why it was that he sort of was unable to reach out for help. In these experiences then of different kinds of assaults, we saw other dimensions. We tell a story in the book of Maddie, who ends up experiencing an assault with their partner. Maddie uses they, them pronouns in large part out of an act of solidarity. So for sort of very long story here, but the short version of it, and that I'll just abbreviate, so not take you through everything that's in the book, is Maddie's partner was going through a transition themselves and their gender identity. And Maddie was suffering from a certain degree of depression and had a really kind of lowered level of sexual desire. And Maddie's partner said to them at one point in time, "You don't think I'm beautiful." And Maddie knew like how deep that could cut as they were transitioning in their gender identity. The idea that like, because your body and your identity weren't a cis body and identity, you were not a beautiful person. And Maddie tells the story of sort of being overwhelmed by this and consenting to sex that they really didn't want to consent to. Again, the context here is thinking about the inequitable landscape that LGBTQIA students experience and how that inequitable landscape is central to sexual assault prevention. Part of our point is to say that like a lot of the prevention that we might be doing around sexual assault isn't about sex. Now, Jennifer and I are huge sex ed proponents, so like don't get us wrong on this. But that in order to move the needle on the kinds of assaults that we see, or the kinds of experiences, harmful experiences that we see with somebody like Adam or Maddie or Charisma or Lupe or Carl, like sex ed isn't enough, because that's not going to solve racism in the criminal justice system, or it's not going to solve homophobia and how that can be structured into Adam's school experience, where like he went through an experience of school where you couldn't even talk about queerness as part of the sex ed curriculum.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing those stories of just noting what you said, that we can't just focus on sex. We can't just focus on preventing, or thinking about bystander intervention, right? That these are much more complicated projects for campus to consider. Adjudication isn't going to help with, addressing some of the deeper level concerns that students are bringing to their sexual projects, which sometimes conflict with the sexual projects of their partners and other students they're encountering. So just to be clear, there's so much complexity here. But the findings in the book articulate the intersections between campus power inequalities and vulnerability to assault. So what's the take home in terms of what campuses should do?
The take home is that they should try to address those power inequalities systematically, as opposed to telling people to act better, or in addition to telling people to act better. We want to make sure that listeners know that the way that we've talked about the book is not exactly how it's written. There's not like a chapter on Black students and a chapter on queer students. It's all woven together towards the argument that once you see the social roots of sexual assault, you can take a much more ambitious approach to prevention. But so here we're talking specifically about what campuses should do in terms of the intersection between sexual assault prevention and DEI work. And I think we've made the argument that DEI work is fundamentally sexual assault prevention, because equality is a sexual assault prevention strategy. So thinking about the ways that inequality is actually engineered into campus life. Think about campuses that allow incoming students to choose their roommates. That is one policy decision that amplifies inequality, because the kids who know each other from lacrosse camp cluster together, and the kids who are the first person from their high school ever to walk onto campus, their first day on campus, they look around, they're like, why does everyone else already have friends? Or if there are orientation programs, like trips and things that students take that are expensive, what you have is the wealthier students starting school with a giant social advantage. So those are sort of the class-related ones. But think about access to social space. We've talked today about the whiteness of Greek life, which is particularly true on the Columbia campus. We know that there are fraternities that are really important at HBCUs and even non-white fraternities at primarily white institutions. But so whether it's Greek life or whose work is on the syllabus or the representation in terms of people of color on the faculty. There are all kinds of ways in which inequalities are actually built into campus life. So it's not bad to try to make better people, but our A game in public health is to think about changing the context. And so this is where we see like a really actionable intersection between sexual geographies, DEI work, and sexual assault prevention. If all of the highest value social spaces on campus belong to white cis hetero men, then that's a problem. And we're not saying y'all take those spaces away from them, but we are suggesting that campuses can work to create parallel spaces that are available to minoritized students so that they can choose the music and decide what beverages are on offer and be the ones to decide who gets in. So Shamus and I are actually working on a thing for campuses to use. It's going to be called the SPACE Toolkit, which SPACE stands for Sexual Assault Prevention and Campus Equity. And we know that there's not one roadmap for schools to use in moving this process ahead, because on every campus there are different challenges, the built environment is different, there are different stakeholders to bring in. But the goal of the SPACE Toolkit is to provide sort of a structured process for schools to assess the spaces that they have, to talk with students about how those spaces are used and where the gaps are, and then imagine modifiable changes to that, whether it's through policies or through repurposing space. We're not talking about like raising $100 million to build a new set of dorms. We're talking about rethinking how spaces are actually used. And so one concrete example from Columbia would be that in our conversations with the vice president for housing and dining, we talked about how students are funneled back into their rooms when the parties end and the bars close. And that's maybe even more true for students who can't afford to go out to the bars in the first place. They have less access to all kinds of privatized social spaces. And so Scott Wright was like, oh, you know, I could fix that. I could just keep one of the cafeterias open all night. And that's not going to solve every problem, but that's just one example of how reimagining what shared spaces can do to create campuses where everyone can thrive is fundamentally both sexual assault prevention and a core goal of DEI work. Shamus, I know you have other thoughts.
Yeah. So first, I threw a kind of Google Doc into the chat, and I want to make clear that the resources that Jennifer and I are creating are going to be totally open source and free. So this isn't our way of trying to hustle campuses to give us money. It's a way to try and help campuses sort of apply the insights from our work in ways that work for them. And so we're kind of in the process of some beta testing of it now, and hopefully we'll have a kind of formal version of it very, very early next year. But another thing I think that we might point to is sort of on a conceptual level is to think for a moment about like the T video. So many of you are probably aware of the T video of, which is very cute and helps convey important information, right? Like if someone said that they wanted tea and then they don't want tea later, don't really get mad at them. It's perfectly fine to change your mind. And if someone's passed out, don't force them to drink tea, don't, etc. And it's this sort of elaborate analogy for consent education. But Jennifer and I occasionally kind of hate on the tea video in maybe a way that's a little unproductive, but I think in this context may be instructive. The tea video is in an empty backdrop with degendered bodies and with deracialized and declassed bodies. Now, part of that is no doubt because of, the video trying to speak to a wide range of experiences, right? If there aren't racialized bodies and there aren't gendered bodies and there's no discernible sexuality and there's no context, every student can presumably look at that situation and it can speak to them. That is, it has a sort of universalistic message. But one of the things that we are trying to point out here is that, like, students don't live in degendered bodies. Like, they don't live in deracialized bodies. They don't live in declassed bodies. They don't live in bodies that have an absent sexuality. And an analysis of sexual assault that is degendered is an analysis that removes power and inequity from the conversation. An analysis that removes race from the T video effectively removes the idea of how race is institutionalized into campus life and is a central structure for the production of inequality. An analysis that removes class doesn't help us see how some students have a far greater control over and access to certain kinds of activities and to spaces where things happen. They can throw the party because they can buy the liquor for it, or because they have the nice couch that their parents brought down, or they have all of these range of things. It doesn't make them bad people, but it certainly creates a power inequity in that context. And people have sexualities. And so, the push in this context to create a universalistic discussion of how it is that sexual assault happens is really located in an understanding of sexual assault and sexual harm centrally around consent. And that if consent is just done properly, it doesn't matter what your race is, it doesn't matter what your gender is, it doesn't matter what your class is, it doesn't matter what your sexuality is, it doesn't matter ability, none of it matters. We just did the consent thing right. Now, Jennifer and I don't think that that's wrong, but we think it's totally insufficient because that's not really how we live our lives. And so what we're trying to bring forward in this conversation is a recognition that, like, students live in campuses that are just ripe with inequalities, that those inequalities create significant power differences between students. And building upon decades of research of feminist researchers on sexual assault, that power creates risks. I want to highlight sort of two dimensions of that risk. We've talked a lot about, sort of in the Scott and Lucy story, about Lucy's lack of experience and Scott's control over space, or in the Charisma story about her lack of financial means and being driven off campus because of the racialization of spaces, or of Lupe's story and their experience, which is somewhat parallel to Charisma's or Adam's or Maddie's. All of these things we've sort of layered on again and again, these discussions of inequities. I think that the final thing that we might, well, it probably isn't the final thing, but the final thing I'll say in the answer to this part of our discussion is another thing that we really want to highlight is how part of DEI work is not just recognizing the absence of power, but the presence of power. That part of DEI work means not just talking to the students who experience sort of domination or subordination or disadvantage, but highlighting advantage, and so, like, in the alcohol conversation, it's all about the risks of being drunk for being assaulted. But what about the alcohol conversation that says something like your risks of assaulting somebody? Or what about a power conversation that highlights how, for some students, we use a driving metaphor a lot, like they're driving around campus in a Humvee and sideswiping people who are on bicycles and really doing a lot of harm. And they need to recognize that they're in a Humvee. And it's sometimes hard for them to see it. And so for us, we sort of think about, as Jennifer said at the first part of this answer, like building that big tent of all of the people who are doing work grounded in equity on campuses, and then highlighting how that conversation for equity is both attached to the broad inequities outside of campus and helping students who experience disadvantage, but also the things that are empowering already empowered students who are committing harm.
Thanks to both of you. I'm just noting some phrases that you all shared, like inequality creates risks, and equality as a sexual prevention strategy, a sexual assault prevention strategy, right, which are so powerful. I'm noting that, in my own experience of working on campuses, right, sexual assault prevention work tends to happen out of an office over here. DEI work happens out of an office over here, right? And so even the ways that the work of creating more less harmful or more welcoming campuses, even that work is happening in separate spaces, right? And so even thinking about the story that you all shared with the Latinx students who had the party, right? That sometimes our racialized spaces are presumed to be cis hetero spaces. Sometimes I'm thinking about the ways that our own work on campus sometimes flattens the complexity that we see, right? That if we've got the big tent approach, maybe we look out at the big tent and see who are the faces that we see most, and so let's address the needs of those groups, and then we forget about the other people in the tent. So I'm just trying to think about, so again, on campuses where some of this work tends to happen separately, right? What recommendations do you all have for bringing that work together? Maybe what examples have you seen of effective work that's happening to bring some of the, again, to align some of these spaces so that we're seeing the work of sexual assault prevention as more than just the work that comes out of the Title IX coordinator's office?
I mean, I think you suggested the answer, Monica, which is to de-silo the work. Mostly when we've traveled around the country through Zoom giving these talks, where we're talking about our work, not hearing from campuses about what they're doing. So we're not actually in the best position to point to best practices. We do know that some campuses have found it super useful to have book clubs, like a sexual citizen book club that brings together the DEI people and people doing sexual assault prevention work with some senior administrators, right? Because if you're going to talk about space policy, there's nothing that is more political on campus than space, right? Shamus and I have both seen colleagues cry because they get an office that they don't feel like sufficiently expresses how important they are. So we're very pro book clubs as a way to begin this conversation and have people discover for themselves what their overlapping interests might be. I think the other part of this is a question about metrics, right? Like if your metric, whether it's in the DEI office or in the sexual violence prevention service, is like the McDonald's metric of millions and millions served, then that's not a metric. Then the sexual violence people serve their people and the DEI people can check off how many seminars they did. That's not a metric of impact that brings people together and that promotes collaboration. And so I think thinking about measurable things that each group can do together, sort of a shared metrics. Shamus and I are big fans of thriving as a metric, but I think even if you do surveys on campus, are there differences in sleep quality across racial and ethnic groups? So I think that's a very upstream way of thinking about the impact of this work. But we saw on the Columbia Barnard campuses that there were, across all axes of social difference, differences in self-reported sleep quality. So I think that figuring out how to work together in doing this stuff, but also figuring out what it would look like to know that you were succeeding is an important part of the path forward.
I mean, I would, just to layer onto this, I mean, I think that, a huge challenge is that for so many people who are doing this work, you're existing in a landscape where the regulatory context is changing, so quickly with, different court rulings, different administrations, right? It's sort of like watching a high-speed tennis match, and the consequences for not adhering to what sort of the range of federal policies are is overwhelming. And so Jennifer and I don't want to roll in here and say we know that you think that your job is sexual assault prevention, but that's not enough. You also have to solve racism in America, right? Or you also have to make sure that homophobia is like no longer a thing. So part of what we're trying to convey is not that like individuals have to do more, but instead that the different individuals who are doing their own thing are actually engaged in an additive or a kind of multiplying project. And that making like, so it's not that all the prevention people have to start doing all of this DEI work, especially like it is, let me be really clear, like that is not our recommendation, because if you don't know how to do DEI work, you shouldn't be doing DEI work, right? Like, and if you haven't been trained in it, and if it's not part of your general practice, like Jennifer and I are big and like stay in your lane, right? But go find the person whose lane it is to do that and say, you know, there's this work that shows that building towards racial equity is central to sexual assault prevention, and to the LGBT folks on campus who are doing stuff within the LGBT center, like to convey to them like, hey, we know that this is a big part of the experience, like sexual assault is a big part of the experience of a lot of LGBTQIA folks on campus. And, you know, how can we together sort of amplify each other's programming and engagement in ways that sort of build on each other? Because like the scary idea is that like you have to do more work. The comforting idea is that there are a lot of people doing work on campus right now who don't see their work as part of sexual assault prevention, but actually that is part of what they're doing by just working towards equity on campus.
And I just want to add one more thing, which is that the reason that we talk so much about space is that this kind of very social structural analysis, if used by itself, can lead to despair, right? Because you're going to think like, oh, my job is to stop racism or create gender equality. And so like, there's not going to be a world, maybe Monica, there will be a day that you do that. But I think for most of us, just to put our pants on one leg at a time, all we can think of is baby steps. And so none of us are going to be able to bring economic equality to a campus, but you can change specific policies about space that make it a little less extreme, right? So by making sure that students can't choose their own roommate, or by not having some student housing more expensive than other student housing, like those are really concrete, actionable things that people can do to build a campus where there is space for everyone. So that's why we talk about space, because we feel like it's a way to apply this so that we don't want to leave you all on a note of despair. We want to leave you all on a note of feeling like this is something that you can move forward.
And we appreciate that. No, I think the power, one of the really powerful things about this book is I think you all bring a spirit of like generosity to the work, like appreciating the work of people who are engaged in sexual assault prevention, DEI work on campus. You also, just the nuanced and layered ways that you describe students' lives as whole and students as whole people, right? And I think that's again, in addition to the power analysis and the really complex power analysis that you bring to this, to the book, I think it's I have, in reviewing it again this weekend, just really took away this gratitude for how nuanced and layered you present students' lives and sexual projects. So I want to leave some time for Jennifer and Shamus to add any final thoughts for our audience.
I just want to share our gratitude. This was a great conversation, Monica. Maybe Shamus has more substantive final thoughts, but I just like we're so happy to be able to share our work. We're delighted to be in conversation with SUNY Arrive and hope that the conversation will literally continue forever. So this may not be the last that you all see of us. And so thank you so much. And Shamus, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we try and say this, I think in every talk, where the sort of, as you sort of pointed out, Monica, the emotional valence of our work is like empathy and hope, not fear and despair. And part of that is that we think that a lot of the challenge for sexual assault prevention is that it is responding to a foundation that's been built for so many young people of thinking about sex and thinking about sexual assault as like a scary thing, in particular sex, as like something that they should be scared about and something where they might be harmed or they might do harm, et cetera. And so what we're really trying to bring to this conversation is a more positive vision of like, instead of like, be afraid, be very, very afraid, things are very bad. We want to say like, things are bad, but we've got things we can do, right? And that holding the people who are doing this work, the students themselves, the institutions in empathy, but then also kind of saying like, here's a little bit of a roadmap that builds a bigger tent. That's really what we're trying to do. So thanks so much, Monica. Jennifer, it's always nice to be in conversation. Jennifer and I are now in different places, and that's a little bit hard, although we gave a talk yesterday and we're giving a talk tomorrow. So I think always lots of time together.
Thanks. Thank you so much to Jennifer and Shamus. And I'll pass it back to Joe and Elizabeth.
The book is Sexual Citizens by Jennifer Hirsch and Shamus Khan. It has been an absolute privilege to be able to talk with you at Spectrum and at our first two sessions, and to know that this will continue. Monica, thank you so much for engaging in this conversation and for joining us late in the day, as it were, to be able to do this and keep this conversation going. I have built my career around the idea that we don't all have to write the book ourselves, but we're all responsible for sentences in a chapter. And I think using what you can find in Sexual Citizens as a guide to each write our own sentence in the work of reducing the impact of violence on our campuses and in our communities is doable. And it's something I hope everyone takes with them. I am grateful to our SUNY Arrive colleagues, especially today, Phil and Morgan and Roma, who helped us run this, as well as my great colleague, Elizabeth Brady. Thank you again to Jennifer and to Shamus and to Monica, and we hope to see you all again soon. That will end the webinar. Take care.